what an incredible pleasure to be asked back to Colorado. Somebody said to me last night, we'd like you to talk about the immigration problem that you have in Britain and in Europe. And I've been thinking, that's a theme that is going to resonate here, right? The problem is not with immigration as such. The problem is with people who have come from dysfunctional hellholes and then arriving somewhere better, promptly set about trying to recreate all of the conditions that pushed them into emigration in the first place. In Europe, the problem is with Islamists from Syria. In Colorado, the problem is with Democrats from California. And I mean, we can see it in the election results, right? But the solution is the same. It's to inculcate them with the values that raised the place that they've arrived in the first place. And that's what the leadership program of the Rockies is so good at doing. Guys, I mean, I really am flattered to be here. And I don't have to say that, right? I don't need to worry about elections at all. After 20 years, I'm a member of the House of Lords. We're famously unelected, and even if I was elected, very few of you would be able to vote for me in Colorado. So believe me when I say that this is my favorite state. I've always said to my wife, if we ever move to the US, it's going to be to a rectangular state where they have referendums and where the people are as open and big and generous as the blue skies. And they don't come more rectangular than Colorado. So Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote a musical about Oklahoma, didn't they? The neighboring state, which, although it has rectilinear bits, is not properly rectangular. I mean, why did they not choose this gorgeous place as the setting? You know, the songs would write themselves. There's a bright golden haze on the mountains. There's a bright golden haze on the mountains. The snow is as deep as old Joe Biden's sleep, and from Kamala Harris we've not heard a peep. I mean, this is, it writes itself, right? But it's a real pleasure coming and being able to say this, because Bob Schaefer will know this. We have to be extra polite during elections. I remember the very last election. By the way, what a great thing to have somebody who really does believe in the principles of limited government and of term limits. So thank you for doing that, Bob. But this is still kind of a home game for him. It's an away game for me. The very last election I fought, I remember canvassing a house, and the door was opened by a little kid who must have been all of about 10 or 11 years old. He was wearing this kind of velvet smoking jacket. It was hanging loosely from his little shoulders. In one hand, he was swirling this great balloon of brandy, about the size of his little head. And in the other hand, smouldering slowly to the ceiling, was what smelled like a very expensive Cuban cigar. Well, as you do when you're canvassing at elections, I leaned down and I said, "Are your parents at home?" And he said, "Does it effing look as though my parents are at home?" So I say with feeling, right? As an ex-politician, it is an absolute delight to be here. And I want to talk about the freedom that I think is embodied in this state. Colorado has various kind of little cameo roles in popular culture. Of course, the hotel in The Shining is here, isn't it? I keep on, this morning in one or two of the corridors here, I kept on thinking I was seeing Jack Nicholson talking to some ghostly bartender. I think it even has a little walk-on role in one of the 50 Shades books, but I'm not the expert on that. But what I really wanted to talk about is Galt's Gulch in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. Not, by the way, the most successful advert for capitalism, in that it almost didn't sell at all. I always thought Dagny and Hank would have been better as the name of a 70s cop series, but isn't it significant that when looking for the place where freedom takes its final stand, when the rest of the world has given up on it and is sliding into corporatism and big government, Ayn Rand chooses to cite it here in Colorado. And that is what I would like to talk to you about for the next few minutes. The shared inheritance of liberty that binds us together as English-speaking peoples. I want to take you back to the 10th of August, 1941, the day that Franklin D. Roosevelt made the longest walk of his presidency. In a way that these days would be unimaginable, the media of that time had contrived to hide the fact of the president's polio from the American electorate. Every photograph showed FDR either seated or standing unaided. But on that day, on that August day, coming from the ships of from the decks of the USS Augusta off Newfoundland, he was determined to walk himself because he was going to have a conference with Winston Churchill, who'd drawn up in the neighboring battleship HMS Prince of Wales. His advisor said, "Don't do it, Mr. President. The deck might buck and you'll end up in an ungainly heap." But he said, "No, I'm going to walk." And so, supported by his son on one side and by a naval officer on the other, he made his slow way across the decks while the band of HMS Prince of Wales struck up the Stars and Stripes Forever. And what followed was the most extraordinary demonstration of the principles that bind together the great Anglophone democracies. It happened to be a Sunday morning. And so the crews of the two vessels were mustered together for a joint religious service. Churchill had chosen every detail, personally and meticulously, down to the hymns, down to the reading that the chaplain gave from the decks. It came from Joshua 2. "As I was with Moses, so will I be with thee. I will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. Be strong and of good courage." And afterwards, Churchill burst out ecstatically, the same language, the same hymns, the same ideals. And I want you to stop for a minute and think about that. When he said the same ideals, this was not a bland generalization about being the good guys. Think of the world as it stood in August 1941. The whole of the Eurasian landmass, from Lisbon to Vladivostok, was under one kind of authoritarian government or another. Liberty was confined to the Anglosphere. The principles which we hold dear, what Cherie just referred to as the principles of the founding and of the Declaration of Independence, were thrown back to the archipelago of English-speaking peoples and to the United States. We sometimes talk about these values as Western values. Sometimes we even call them universal values. But the truth is that we're being polite. The things that elevated our civilization, raising the individual above the collective, raising the law above the rulers, making the rules sovereign so that the people in charge don't get to make things up as they go along. These principles were overwhelmingly adumbrated in the language in which you are listening to these words. Habeas corpus, regular elections, equality before the law, jury trials, uncensored newspapers. If they became universal, let's be honest, it was because of a series of military endeavors by the English-speaking peoples in arms. Imagine that the Second World War had ended differently. Or imagine that the Cold War had ended differently. There would have been nothing universal about them then. And I want to talk about what world those principles, those precepts brought into being and how we have to defend it. You know, we take a lot of these things for granted because almost all of us have grown up without knowing any alternative. But those principles had a very specific moment and place where they were born. Yes, they drew on an ancient tradition, going back through the Declaration of Independence, through to the English Bill of Rights, before that to the Magna Carta, before that even to the folk right of Anglo-Saxon common law, this ideal that the law holds the government to account rather than being an expression of state power. But they were encoded as a set of international principles in August 1941 off Newfoundland in the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter became, in effect, the Allied war aims when the United States joined the war 4 months later, and served as the war aims of NATO. And after 1990, became generalized. And what are these ideals? Well, the idea that a country should not be able to help itself to the neighboring territory of somebody who was offering it no threat. The idea that borders should not be altered by force, the idea that civilian government is preferable to military rule, the idea that disputes should be arbitrated peacefully. All of these things were not taken for granted in the 1930s. They had their birth in 1941, and they have made the world that we've grown up in. A world of peace and plenty that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. A world that has raised our species to a pinnacle of wealth and has given us powers that our ancestors would have attributed to gods or wizards. But that didn't just happen on its own. It happened because, in the last analysis, we were prepared to defend those values. And we were prepared to teach them, right? Again, none of these things come naturally. We're a tribal species. We evolved on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa. Might is right comes very easily to us. The idea of attacking another country because you can, because you're stronger, would have gone unnoticed and unremarked in almost every previous civilization right up until 1940. We tried to inject morality into foreign policy, to inject principle, to say that there are some things you don't do just because you can do them. And that is a process that requires us constantly to teach people. This is the vital work of organizations like this one, right? Teaching people the counterintuitive ideas that individuals have rights, that we're not defined by birth or caste, that the fact that you're white or female or whatever it is not the most important thing about you, that we all have dignity and freedom as individuals. The great German-American philosopher Hannah Arendt once said, every generation Western civilization is invaded by barbarians, we call them children, right? What she means by that is you and I came into this world with the same mental and emotional apparatus that we would have done 10,000 years ago. The reason we don't live the way we did 10,000 years ago is because we have built an accumulated civilization where the best ideas are cherished and are taught. There was a time when they were taught in schools and colleges. The primary function of education was to be a temple of the Enlightenment, to show people these counterintuitive ideas. The idea, for example, that people you don't like might still be telling the truth. When that doesn't happen, then it falls to the leadership program of the Rockies and allied organizations to make the same arguments. If we are serious about spreading those ideas and defending them, we need to do two things. First, we need to live them ourselves. And this is where I agreed very much with the remarks that your Vice President made in Munich a couple of weeks ago. During the Cold War, we understood that we were living, as well as defending, a better civilization. We understood that we were living in a better society because you couldn't disappear in the middle of the night to a torture chamber without due process, because contract was honored, because property was respected, and because the individual was elevated above the collective. Free speech, free association, free contract, these things ennobled Western civilization and distinguished it from its rivals. J.D. Vance was quite right to say that Europe has turned its back on a number of those principles. We've slid from our ideals and we've reached the point where free speech is no longer a value, where the imagined sensitivities of protected minorities are now held to be more important than fundamental liberties. But it's not enough just to live them. We have to be prepared also to defend them. And if we compare, with all its imperfections, the society of Western Europe or of Britain, and I've been one of the loudest critics, but we compare that society to the society that Vladimir Putin has created in Russia, where journalists are routinely assassinated, where opposition leaders are thrown in prison, tortured, and murdered in the most mafia way while in captivity, and where it is routine to invade and occupy neighboring states simply because you can. That surely is the greater threat to our way of life, the greater threat to the principles on which this great republic was founded. And so I do have to ask, let's think back to what it was that the Atlantic Charter stood for. Defending that idea that you don't change borders by force, and being prepared ultimately to deploy proportionate force in defense of freedom. If we've reached the point where we are lining up with Russia against Ukraine, while simultaneously attacking an open and liberal society like Canada, something is going wrong. And as American patriots, you should be thinking about that. There's something else that's in the Atlantic Charter. It's almost never mentioned, but along with all of those principles about non-aggression and the rule of law, it commits itself to open sea lanes and the free exchange of goods and ideas. Free trade has made us an extraordinarily rich people. The acceleration in rising living standards since 1945, because we'd moved away from the autarky and protectionism that the autocrats had inflicted on us in the 30s, is without precedent. Supply lines have grown, and trade between wealthy countries and developing countries works both ways. The poor get richer, and the rich get even richer as they move up the supply chain. Now, I realize that this is always an unpopular argument. There has never been a moment when free trade has been a popular cause, never once. Exactly 200 years ago, 200 years and a couple of months ago, in 1824, the great Whig politician and British historian Lord Macaulay said, "Free trade, the greatest blessing that a government can bestow upon a people, is in every country unpopular." And it was true in 1824, and it was true in 1924, and it was true in 2024, and it was true in every one of those intervening years because it is counterintuitive. As I said, we were not designed for this world of skyscrapers and superabundance. We evolved on the savannas of Pleistocene Africa. And so the idea of depending on strangers for stuff that you can't see feels wrong. Human beings being as we are, we start with our gut feelings and we reason backwards. And that's what almost all people do on free trade. It's why it's always unpopular. It's why, or to flip it around, it's why the protectionist or the mercantilist is always guaranteed a sympathetic audience when he says we can't afford a trade deficit like this, or we need to produce our own food, or we need to protect our strategic industries, or we can't afford to trade with countries with low wages. All of those things seem sensible. They are all talking to our inner caveman, but all of them, when translated into policy, serve to make us poorer. I think it was P.J. O'Rourke who said, free trade in this sense is really an IQ test, not an ideological test, right? Most of us start with a gut feeling which is protectionist. I certainly did. Some of us then look into the economics and see that free trade makes us all richer. Most people just stick with their hunches. It's a very human thing. Quite apart from the psychological pressure, the feeling of weirdness, there's also the political pressure. Right? It's always popular to single out one particular industry for special treatment, at least with that industry. Free trade works on the basis of dispersed gains but concentrated losses, or protectionism, if you like, works the other way around, on the basis of dispersed losses and concentrated gains. So if you decide that you're going to prop up the steel industry, okay, you might save a few thousand jobs in steel. Think of the damage that you're doing to every steel-using industry downstream, to construction, to car making, to electronic appliances, to railways, right? There are many, many more workers in those places. You're going to do far more damage to your economy, but those people aren't going to vote accordingly, whereas the handful of steel workers will. And so you've always got this perverse incentive. But I would ask you, everyone in this room, what makes you trust government officials to make that call correctly? When did governments become so wise? When did they suddenly become able to pick winners in this disinterested, high-minded, patriotic way? How can you be sure that the protected industries, even if we accept an argument for it, will be the ones that are actually of strategic interest rather than the ones that are the best connected politically or have the most powerful labor unions? Or let me put it another way, since there's all this talk about using tariffs as a way of affecting foreign policy, as a way of inflicting damage on other countries or threatening them to do things. Let me ask you all a question. Why, in an actual war, do we blockade the enemy? What are we trying to achieve when we cut the supply lines of a hostile belligerent? We're trying to make them poorer, yeah? We're trying to stop them buying stuff. We're trying to cut them off from the rest of the world so that their standard of living falls, they have less money, and they are less able to wage war, right? So can we all agree that we're not doing it to nurture their infant industries, right? We're not doing it to try and bring them up to a higher standard of production so that they become more competitive, right? So why do to ourselves in peacetime through tariffs what we do to the enemy in war? Purely because of these maladaptations in our brain that always make it popular and the lobbying of certain industries. My friends, I want us to recommit in full to the principles of the founding and to their internationalization as expressed in the Atlantic Charter. And there are concrete things we can be doing. Like my country left the European Union. We're now able to make our own decisions when it comes to trade. It is extraordinary that we have not yet secured a free trade agreement with the United States, which is by far our biggest trading partner. And the reason we couldn't do it when we were in the EU is because the European Union is deeply suspicious of American expertise and enterprise, right? There are a number of defensive interests in Brussels, particularly in agriculture, that we don't have as a country, but that we were not able to get around because the EU does trade on behalf of all of its members. Now we can. We could have a big, beautiful, ambitious bilateral deal between our two countries. You are by far the biggest investor in Britain, and we are the biggest investor here. Every day, 1 million Brits clock into work for US-owned companies. Every day, 1 million Americans show up to work for British-owned companies. The trade is the only thing that hasn't followed because it was until now controlled by Brussels, but we now have the opportunity to do something about it. And I want us to have a trade deal that is properly comprehensive, that works for the little guy, not for the big corporations, that is based around the idea of mutual recognition of goods, of services, of professional qualifications. As a general rule, whatever is legal in this country should be legal in mine, and vice versa. If a drug is approved by the FDA, that should be good enough for us. Think of what good news that would be for everyone except regulators and bureaucrats. Think of the rise in living standards that would come from the increased competition. And with that trade deal should come a renewed commitment to our military alliance. Today happens to be the 40th anniversary of Margaret Thatcher's address to Congress. She is only the second British Prime Minister after Winston Churchill to be accorded that honour. And her words are worth rereading 40 years on. To summarise a long and rather beautiful speech, she called for Western resolve in the face of defeatism and of encroachment by hostile ideologies. February 1985, there was a lot of defeatism around in Europe. The USSR had been expanding and expanding, most recently into Afghanistan, and there were all sorts of people in continental Europe saying, we don't want US missiles here, we want to be able to reach some accommodation, we don't need to be fighting each other. And she had the clarity of vision to say, you do not compromise with an ideology that is fundamentally inimical to your entire way of life. That Brezhnev, like Putin, has made no secret of the fact that he hates the West and everything it stands for. And she and Ronald Reagan stood firm in the face of that threat. They deployed the necessary military hardware, and they liberated hundreds of millions of people from the tyranny of communism. And that is the kind of resolve we want today. We need to show that we are still the people that our fathers were, that we haven't lost that belief in the principles that actuated them through the 2 world wars and through the Cold Wars. And so let me end, because I want to leave a little bit of time for questions, let me end with a heartfelt plea from a British conservative who loves his country very much to American patriots who still believe in theirs. Honor those founding principles of which Shari was speaking. Honor the vision of your founders. Never forget that it is your privilege to have inherited these sublime ideals, and that that privilege carries with it a commensurate responsibility to keep them intact and pass them on securely to those who come after. Never be afraid to speak to and for the soul of this great nation, of which, by good fortune and God's grace, you are privileged to be part. Thank you very much. Now, as I understand it, we've got two microphones, one in that aisle and one in that. So do you want to just fire away? We'll take a question from the lady there first.
My name is Kathleen Chandler, and I'm from the class of 2007. My question is, last night at the wonderful event you were at, you'd mentioned that being kind of anti-Canadian has stifled the conservative movement in Canada. And you talked about how that's really not good for Canada, much less the United States. So now that Canada won the big hockey game last night, what should our response be? How can we help the people of Canada see that we actually need a good, strong neighbor to our north?
Yeah, thank you very much. So apologies if I repeat myself for those who were there last night, but Canada is facing an election this year. And the Conservatives were a shoo-in. The Conservatives are led by an exceptional politician called Pierre Poilievre, who is, in my estimate, the best Conservative politician on the planet right now, in terms of his intelligence, his commitment, his energy, but also his patriotism and his belief in the kind of principles that the LPR upholds. On the eve of Donald Trump announcing a tariff on Canada, Pierre and his party were nearly 30 points ahead in the opinion polls. Now they are 2 points ahead. And that has happened for two reasons. First, in a time of crisis, people rally to the incumbent. And the leftist incumbent Liberal Party in Canada has benefited from people thinking, oh, what are we going to do? We all need to show solidarity. Second, because from a Canadian point of view, these repeated threats of annexation make the US Republican Party so unpopular that that has spilled over into support for the Canadian Conservative Party. And it's so needless, right? I mean, I assume that there isn't actually another plan to invade Canada. It was tried, I think, in 1775 and then again in 1812, and we've reached a place where I think it's pretty clear that the Canadians don't want to be invaded. But let's assume it's kind of lighthearted or whatever, and it's seriously, not literally, and all that. If you lived with a partner who kept on saying, I'm going to push you down the stairs, I'm going to stab you with a kitchen knife, I'm going to run you over, you might not take them literally, right? You might think that they're not actually going to push me down there, but would you really want to stay with them? You're going to be thinking, look, there's hostile intent here, right? And if only that talk would be replaced by something far more positive, right? Which is the idea of a union of the English-speaking peoples in defense of liberty. Donald Trump says we've got a terrible problem with a trade deficit with Canada, but he then says this would disappear if they were annexed. Well, that's in a way actually very revealing, right? Because if Canada was annexed, the same people would be buying and selling the same stuff to the same other people, right? Nothing would have changed. It's a very neat illustration of why trade deficits really don't matter and why there is never any correlation between a trade balance and the prosperity of a country. But why not just get that benefit anyway by extending to Canada the same sort of deal that I was talking about, where you just say whatever is legally on offer on one side of the border is legally on offer on the other. And then it wouldn't matter whether a product was Canadian or American, and everyone would benefit commensurately. Question over there, sir.
Yeah, Paul Wiesner, Greenwood Village. Thank you very much for being here. My question has to deal with free trade, so I'm glad you ended the comment there on that. I agree everything you say about free trade.
Brilliant question, Paul. Thank you very much. We've got time for it.
And I'm wondering, is there a caveat to free trade where you do not want to trade with your enemies, those that are ideologically opposed to you, because you will get them wealthy, you will transfer your knowledge, you'll transfer your technology to them. So is there a caveat to your free trade doctrine?
So, of course, there is a security caveat. And for the avoidance of doubt, I am much more hawkish about China than most people on the Hill, right? And the real threat I see from China is that they are evolving an alternative governmental model and societal model that is capable of export. They've built this terrifying panopticon state based on surveillance, geolocation, face recognition technology that allows them to control people in a way that would have been unthinkable. They've pressed every notionally private company into being part of this surveillance state, Weibo, Tencent, Alibaba, and the rest. And there is nothing to stop them saying, we'll sell this to Venezuela or whatever. You don't need to worry about elections anymore. You can keep your people in line the way we have. So I see them as a very, very serious existential threat in a way that Iran or Russia is not, because those places are dysfunctional kleptocracies. China is offering a different and more hostile model. That is something that you deal with military and diplomatic and strategic resolve, which I don't think we're doing, right? This is the odd thing. If you fly from Los Angeles to Peking, in terms of the travel links, the visas, the diplomatic courtesies accorded to from one state to the other, China is treated as a completely friendly state. The only way in which it's not treated as a friendly state is for these demands, is when it comes to these demands for tariffs. Now, tariffs don't solve any of the problems that we're talking about. The reverse engineering of technology, the intellectual property theft, all of that is happening with or without tariffs, right? The idea that you resolve these problems by raising prices in the US is crazy. Actually, there was a story in the Gazette this morning. I always like to keep up with the local news. There was a story in the Gazette this morning about how delighted the Chinese were with the prospect of steel tariffs because they think it'll wipe out US auto manufacture and give them a great global lead when it comes to electric vehicles, right? So we're using a sledgehammer to miss a nut with tariffs, right? We're not having the effect that we want to have, which is to deter aggression, but we are having the unintended consequence of making American consumers poorer, which makes the whole American economy poorer, which means there's less of a surplus for defense spending. Yes, please.
Thank you. Dawn Lamping, class of 2018 from Pitkin County. I would love to hear your analysis of the role of Poland in the current European chessboard.
Sorry, in the current chess play?
In just the European chessboard, like what's all going on over there in the East? What role does Poland play? I think they're very unique in that area with an amazing history that could be very powerful. Okay, thanks.
Yes. When the Ukraine conflict began, I immediately dropped what I was doing and went to the Polish-Ukrainian border to ferry refugee women and children through to places from which they could then be resettled. And I was absolutely humbled by what the Poles were doing. And I don't just mean the Polish government, I mean ordinary people. The phone companies were giving away free SIM cards to the refugees. The newspapers were running special Ukrainian language editions. Every Airbnb owner was opening up their property. Every hotel was taking in Ukrainian refugees. It was an extraordinary thing. At a time, by the way, when Poland was getting nothing but abuse from the EU because it didn't want to surrender the supremacy of its national legal system vis-a-vis Brussels. Why do Poles feel so strongly about this? Right? Poland has had a very checkered history with Ukraine. That was not always a natural and obvious pairing. I think the reason that Poles felt that way is because they, of all people, know what it means to lose your sovereignty, to be occupied by somebody else. They know that whatever that somebody else says, they will never govern you as well as you would govern yourselves. And the struggle of Poland for the renewal of its independence and its autonomy is an extraordinarily inspiring one, and that's why they are so touchy about any threat to their self-government, whether it comes from Moscow or from Brussels. Doesn't every nation have that equivalent right? Isn't that fundamentally what the Declaration of Independence was about? And isn't it why, traditionally, US sympathy overseas was always for democracy and freedom rather than for stability or for realpolitik or for doing deals with dirty tyrants? Yes, we sometimes flouted our ideals. Yes, in the Cold War, we lined up with some unpleasant regimes, but although we flouted them, we never abandoned them. We never pretended that it was all in the past and that now we were just in a world of might is right. I don't particularly like the Russian regime, but I don't dispute that Russia has the right to exist as a nation, or that China has. And so has Ukraine. So has any nation that wants to live under its own laws and its own people in its own sovereign parliament. And there was a time when all of us in a room like this would have taken that without saying. It alarms me that what I've just said should now be regarded as controversial in some Republican circles here. Sir.
Danny.
Oh, yeah, hi.
Danny Moore, class of 2019, Arapahoe County. Thank you very much for your words. There's been a lot of criticism of the First Amendment attacks in Europe. Can you talk to what the U.S. role was in kind of lighting that match?
Yeah, sorry not to have recognized you. I've got very strong light in my eyes, so forgive me if I don't spot people. If I were a US citizen, I would remember in my prayers every day the far-sighted men who gave this country the Bill of Rights. In a way, it was an odd thing to have to do, right? You have a written constitution that says, here's what the federal government is allowed to do, and if it's not in this document, it's not allowed, right? So it's kind of a weird thing that you then almost immediately come along and say, yeah, but we need another list of things that they're really, really, really not allowed to do. You'd think that that would be implied, and yet thank heaven you did, because it is the absence of a First Amendment that has landed Europe in the mess it's in. Something that has happened since and as a consequence, I think, of victory in the Cold War. When we had this other on our doorstep, and we defined ourselves as a free people, or as an alliance of free peoples, we were much touchier about restrictions on free speech, or free assembly, or free movement. But now, as you heard me say last night, Danny, we've elevated the imagined sensitivities of minorities as the supreme goal of public policy. So free association, free contract, free speech are all tested against an imaginary case where it might cause offense to somebody. And because we sacralized this ideal, because we elevated it out of the normal sphere of conversation, all of those things were allowed to fall by the wayside. I have to say, this tendency, this identity politics, began here. It spilled out of US campuses and infected the rest of the English-speaking world. And I very much hope that the cure, like the original infection, will have come from here. That just as you guys were first in and are first out of this DEI madness, so the rest of the English-speaking world that picked it up from here is now also going to get the immunity that comes from having copied your ideas. And that really would be a very worthy way of marking the kinds of things that led to our countries being allies in the first place. We've got time for 2 or 3 more questions. Yes, please.
Ross Kaminsky, Arapahoe County.
Oh, hello, Ross. Sorry,
Hello,
I repeat my words about not recognizing people with the lights.
21st LPR retreat in a row for me. So you were one of the most prominent supporters of Brexit. You put yourself out of a job by winning that fight. Now that you've been in it for a few years, I'm wondering 2 things. What are the main lessons and results of Brexit so far, including anything you might mention that has not been as good as you expected? And if there were another Brexit vote right now, how do you think your country would vote?
Yes, thank you. Well, let me take the last point first, Ross. We were always behind in the opinion polls the first time round. So the opinion polls now show there's a weird thing in politics everywhere, that the grass is always greener. Right? It's a kind of loser's premium. It's often the case in politics that you choose X and some positive and negative things will happen. You choose Y or not X and a different set of positive and negative things will happen. And either way, people will look at those negatives and say, you should have chosen the other, right? That's everyone who's ever been involved in politics in having to make decisions needs to understand that we're dealing with imperfect outcomes. But I don't think there is any question that we would vote to leave again. And for the same reason, I remember actually a constituent of mine saying at the time, she said, I don't really know very much about how the EU works, but it seems to me that this is the working classes against the smirking classes. And I think most people in the US or anywhere else will understand that dynamic, right? Even if it's played out on different issues from Brexit. I have been, that said, disappointed by how slow we have been to seize the opportunities of domestic deregulation and of overseas commerce. We could, outside the EU, have got away from some of the crazier net zero rules. Instead, we've adopted even stricter ones than we had as members. We could have been much more ambitious in opening up our trade. It's not true that we've done nothing. We have very good deals with Canada and Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific Partnership countries, but we didn't complete our talks with India. We didn't complete our talks here. Although that was actually mainly Joe Biden's fault. We'd actually got quite far with Donald Trump. And then Joe Biden came in and said, we're not going to do any trade with anyone. And so we've got 2/3 of the stuff done on the shelf if the Donald wants to take it off and start again. Why have I been disappointed? What went wrong? And this, I think, is relevant for what Trump 2.0 is doing. I underestimated the power of frustrating and immobilizing things vested in the administrative state. The number of obvious, simple things that we could have done that were frustrated purposefully by our officials, who have a much stronger position in a parliamentary system than here, where the president is able to bring in people from the outside. So, a small example. We inherited from the EU a load of tariffs and quotas for foodstuffs that we don't produce. We have tariffs on oranges, on olives and olive oil, on tomatoes, as they're properly called, right? And we still, 5 years after Brexit, have all of these things in place. We don't grow any, I mean, we do grow a tiny number of tomatoes. We don't grow any olives, right? Why? Whenever I asked our officials, why has this not happened? And the politicians were always saying, do this, just make it cheaper. The officials would say, oh, well, it's all part of this complex negotiation, and we'll take that off when the final deal is done. I realized after a while this was all nonsense. That what was actually happening is that our civil servants, who were anti-Brexit from day one, couldn't bear to give up on the thought of rejoining, and therefore frustrated any measure that was going to lead to us diverging from the EU, and therefore was going to make it harder for us to come back in. And that, by the way, is another advantage to us of a US deal. It will make it much, much harder for us to accept an EU regulatory framework, because we'll have a much more open and liberal one if we sign up here. So let's see if we can make that happen.
Thanks, Dan.
Time for two more, sir.
Michael Williams, defender and champion of laissez-faire capitalism, though I'm still trying to claw my way back into LPR in the first place. I really appreciate your presentation today. I know you pushed a few buttons. I have a question. I want to go back to something you said and have you articulate more about this, because I try to explain this to people, and you do so much more eloquent job than I do. This whole issue of being born barbarians, and that this stuff is not natural. Address the phrase that we use all the time, natural rights. Kind of do some reconciliation there, because they're not really natural at all, as you explained. Right.
They would have been regarded as highly unnatural by every previous civilization for 10,000 years until an eye blink ago, right? This is my real problem with woke. This is my real problem with identity politics. It's not that it's all a bunch of palpable nonsense and harumph political correctness gone mad. I think conservatives make a mistake when they dismiss it that way. The much more serious problem with woke is that it is intuitive. And it takes off very easily because we are tribal creatures. Right? And that, so our schools for a long time had this role of trying to teach people the things that didn't come naturally, the empirical method, the scientific method, the idea that truth is not handed down by some sacerdotal or political authority, but it can be reached by a process of interrogation and experimentation and debate. That is now, not only is it not done in schools, schools are doing the opposite. Schools are teaching you that the most important thing about you is that you're black or female or whatever it is, right? Which is, it is impossible to maintain an open society if we don't primarily see each other as fellow citizens rather than as Presbyterians or whatever, right? We've got to have that fundamental nexus in place. And the odd thing about this is the exponents call it postmodernism, right? This idea that the truth is just a product of the power structures of the day, but really it's a kind of pre-modernism. The values that they hold would have been immediately recognized from the early Iron Age slave empires to the medieval European monarchies, right? Where people are classed, where their life is mapped out for them, because we hadn't had that modern revolution where contract, freedom, displaced caste, birth, and heredity as the way in which individuals relate one to another. And for that reason, I see it as really dangerous and really contingent if we stop defending it. Nature pours back in. Right? The moment we stop doing these things, we go back very quickly to the values of vendetta and feud. Here's a thing about my own country, if you'll allow me a small digression. One of the things that is very beautiful and is never remarked about Britain is that we took in a lot of people who had come and settled in Britain because of the intercommunal violence that scarred the partition of India, where people did unspeakable things to one another. And the victims and the perpetrators settled in the same towns and the same streets and lived next door to one another and left it all at the door. And similar things happened in North America. And the reason that they were able to do that is because our legal system, our political system, and our morality emphasized individual personal responsibility above everything else. It was not a good argument that somebody's grandfather had done something to hurt yours. And because people could buy into that, we had this extraordinary success with the integration. Despite the people, if you meet a Brit of South Asian background, they are almost always ancestrally from one of the areas that was most badly touched by the violence, right? All forgotten, they just don't, they didn't want to talk about it. Now look at these divisions on our streets in Britain about the war in Israel and Gaza. We don't have very many Israeli or Palestinian citizens, and yet people have latched on to one side or the other of the argument and have begun to tribalize it. So they're saying, I'm so angry about whatever has happened on whichever side I'm on. I'm so angry about the atrocities suffered by my side that if I can't find the perpetrator, I will take my anger out on the first Muslim or the first Jew I meet, because that's as close as I can get. Now, that would have been a very recognizable way of thinking to everybody else until just now. And that's what I mean by keeping alive our sacred ideals of freedom. Natural rights are highly unnatural, but look at what they've achieved. Time for one last question.
Thank you. Jamison Dyan, Teller County, graduate of LPR class of 2024. I was hoping you could address a common American perspective on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. If you look at the last several decades, NATO has marched its military assets closer and closer to the Russia border. The Russia perspective, they say, after 2 world wars of really costly invasions, that's really antagonistic. And then as Americans, we've watched as our treasure, a huge amount of our money, disproportionately from what Europeans have contributed towards the Ukraine conflict in their own backyard, has gone to a corrupt regime in Ukraine. I think a recent report is that half the money is unaccounted for. What is your perspective on that?
So let me just start with that very last point you made, because I think it's very telling. Zelensky never said that half the money was unaccounted for. He said that half the promised money had not arrived. To say that it's unaccounted for, that's a claim that has its origin in Russian propaganda sites, as is the claim that he has only 4% public support. Right? That is a Russian claim. Actually, his popularity has been on the slide since 2022 when he was in the 90s, but now he's still in the 50s, slightly in front of where Donald Trump is. The claim that he's a dictator is absurd. The Ukrainian constitution prohibits you holding elections during wartime, right? We didn't have an election in the UK during the Second World War. Churchill finally had the election in 1945 because we couldn't do it while we were under full mobilization. Now look, I don't think Zelensky is any kind of a saint, right? And I don't think that's relevant. I think what counts here is, do we still believe in a global order based on the idea that you can't change frontiers by force and you can't help yourself to neighboring territory. When we gave our guarantee to Poland that led to the Second World War, Poland was led by an obviously dictatorial regime, right? By the Beck autocracy. That was irrelevant. The fact was that if we didn't stand by them having given that pledge, we'd have been giving up on any pretense of international legality. Now, when Ukraine surrendered its nuclear arsenal in 1994, it did so on the basis of a promise that its independence would be guaranteed within its then existing frontiers. Who guaranteed that promise? The United Kingdom, the United States, and, never forget, Russia. For Russia then to turn around and invade them must rank as one of the greatest acts of treachery in modern history. I am sympathetic with the idea that the US should be careful in stewarding its resources, right? I'm not any kind of neocon. I was against the Iraq war. I was against the Afghan war. You don't want to be in a position of maintaining expensive foreign garrisons. Isolationism is a position that, although I don't share it, I can respect. A genuine isolationism that says, Putin's an absolute bastard, but wake me up when he gets to Seattle, I could get on board with that, right? But that's not what we're seeing here. We're seeing Russian propagandist claims being repeated by the leader of the world's greatest republic. We're seeing the scary prospect of the United States lining up with Russia in Ukraine, while at the same time, not only picking fights with Canada, but making territorial claims on Denmark, which is the sovereign power in Greenland. Do you know, when I was in the European Parliament, I spent one Christmas in Kandahar. I went to visit those of my constituents who were serving in Afghanistan. And there in the British base that was patrolling Helmand was a substantial Danish contingent. Why were the Danes in Afghanistan? They hadn't been attacked by the Taliban. They didn't have any strategic interests, if there are any strategic interests in that country of empty rubble, right? They were there because they regarded the Americans as their friends and allies. They had been touched and affected by the horrors of 9/11, and they wanted to do their bit. If we are now making aggressive claims on a country like that, then how can we possibly criticize, never mind Putin, how can we possibly criticize China if they want to take Taiwan? This is the dangerous thing about tearing up the Atlantic Charter and giving up on any concept of an international order. If the US wants to withdraw, cut off the money, you have that right. No one disputes that. I think it's arguably dishonorable after the word you gave in 1994, and that's certainly the reason why I want Britain to remain involved. We also gave our words. But no one questions that you have the right to retrench and pull out and stop funding things. But switching sides to the point that you are now lining up with Putin against Zelensky, that is not an America I ever thought I would see.